So we talked through defensibility in the first form of defensibility, which is network effects. We've briefly gone over the 4 different types that are the most common and powerful in tech companies: direct, data, cross-site, and platform network effects. We've talked about how the value of network effects is measured based on how the value to the user scales as you get more users and usage and the different patterns that you might come across. We know that network effects, as we implement them, help increase the underlying components and inputs of growth. It helps increase retention, helps improve acquisition, as well as improve monetization. So what we need to talk about now is how you would methodically approach building a network effect step by step. Growing network effects is all about order of operations. Those order of operations follow a loop system. The first question is, how do you constrain the initial audience to make density of the network effect easier? The second question is, what is the hook or value you offer to your initial audience to get them there? The third is the time to density. So what is the minimal density that you need for that target audience, and how do you get there as quickly as possible? And finally, how do you use that initial audience and density to leverage it and build demand for that next audience? The easiest way to look at this is through some examples of the different types of network effects and how companies prior have gone through this system. Let's talk about the direct network effect, where the value increases as more users and customers like you use the product. If we look back at Facebook, we could see how in the early days they followed this framework to a T in order to get their direct network effect started. They first, by constraining the audience, they started with Harvard-only students, a relatively dense and small audience. So once again, to get that liquidity between the network effect, they're tightly constraining the audience to just a few thousand people that are locally dense as well. The second thing was finding a hook to get them onto the product, and that was single player mode as an online directory was the first core value prop of the product. The next step was figuring out, how do I accelerate that time to density for that initial constrained audience that I have? And what Zuckerberg and crew did is that they emailed the entire Harvard directory to accelerate the time to density. And finally, they figured out a way to leverage that into the next audience by collecting emails of friends of those Harvard students at other universities. And once they had enough emails at those other universities, they would launch that university another constrained audience, which would go through this framework again. We could also think about this in the context of the early days of Snapchat. They first started by constraining the audience to college fraternities and sororities. The product hook was disappearing photo messages, which hadn't existed before. The time to density was that they posted to Greek life forums and other email lists in order to accelerate that time to that initial constrained audience. And then they leveraged it by expanding to friends of friends in those fraternities and sororities. We could also think this through other types of network effects. A data network effect, where when the product cost and or quality improves with increased data collection, actually starts later in the life cycle of a company, where there's enough data to actually improve that product cost or quality. But let's look at some other types of network effects, like cross-site network effects, where when the value to one type of user or customer increases as the user or customers of another type join the network and vice versa. If we looked at Etsy as an example, they initially constrained and focused on crafters in the local area of Brooklyn, so really constraining that initial audience. The product hook was a much easier place to sell their crafts than a place like eBay. They accelerated the time to density by using access to a crafting forum and community to post and accelerate the awareness of that initial constrained audience. And finally, they leveraged that initial crafters into other types of storefronts and other types of crafters, repeating the steps of the loop. We can also look at this in the play of a platform network effect. They follow the same general steps, but a slightly different set of questions. So on the constraint step, the question is, who are the initial developers that you can offer the most value for? The hook is, what is the value you can offer them? Is it distribution, revenue, maybe special deals? And then how do you accelerate the time to density in terms of getting enough developers on the platform? Create a fund, do it yourself in terms of implementing them yourself. And finally, how do you leverage that by celebrating and showing off the success of those initial developers to attract the next group? You could see this at play in Slack, where their initial constraint where they focused on developers targeting other tech companies, because that's where Slack had the biggest audience. Their hook was that they offered distribution to their user base, featured placements, as well as including them in press announcements. The time to density was that they accelerated that by creating a Slack fund where it invested in companies that integrated to the platform. And finally, they leveraged the initial success of those initial developers through press release after press release to gain additional developers. So in the next section, what we want to do is start to introduce the three other forms of defensibility. While network effects is the one that has created the most value over the 20 years, there are definitely companies that have been created that are highly valuable that don't have network effects. So what are the other forms of defensibility that help improve their growth over time? We'll be talking about that in the next section as we dive into brand, embedding, and scale.